Most people miss the real story. Subscribe if you want to see everything.
In this harsh land, the snows of winter rose to the height of a man's head, and even in the summer their fall did not wholly cease, for such was the harshness of that land. Yet on rare occasion, once in a span of decades, there came a year when summer tides settled upon the land with an intensity so deep that the soil was left fully parched, and it was one such year. Standing within the courtyard of a stone fortress, an elderly woman called out to the black-haired man beside her, addressing him as Ulrich. She observed that he did not age, nor did he die, to which he calmly responded that it was quite so. The woman looked at him with a weary smile and asked him to pray tell if such a life was not one filled with torment. He remained silent for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting a deep void, before explaining that time flowed ever onward while he alone was left in its wake. He mused that even the elves, who seemed as though they might abide forever, were eventually claimed by their end, and the first of dragons, born long before he was, had long since faded to dust in some far-off land. He admitted that he had let go of far too many and would go on letting more slip away, so if she were to ask him, he confessed that of course it was painful. As he turned his back and walked away, he noted that because they were mortal, memories would eventually fade. He explained that the present became the past, leaving naught but memories as fragments behind, and the agony eventually turned into longing. The elderly woman looked up at the sky and asked if she too would one day be but a memory to him, and he looked back over his shoulder, admitting that he supposed so. Closing her eyes, Hild whispered that had he said he would remember her forever, it would have been a delight most rare. She then asked him to hark to her as she had a favor to ask. As he took her aging hands in his, she pleaded that when she died, he should take up her title. She requested that he rule this land, protect its people, and carry on in her stead. Looking deeply into his eyes, she made a final request for him to keep her in his memories for as long as he was able. Despite Hild's wish, the man knew that his memories of her would eventually fade. He recalled her as a young child and then as a smiling woman, realizing that once even those who shared those moments were gone, a day might come when even the faintest reminiscence blurred. He gripped the golden ring she had given him tightly in his fist as it shimmered with light, resolved that yet so, his life would continue. Standing before her grave in the biting cold of a snowy cemetery, he was approached by an attendant who addressed him as sire. The man warned that the air was yet cold and beseeched him to return within. Ulrich acknowledged that he must keep moving forward and responded that yes, he ought to do so. As he walked away, leaving a trail of footprints in the frozen ground, he realized that even if new encounters would inevitably end in farewells, all that time spent would not be wholly filled with pain. Chapter 1. Nestled in the northern reaches of the Osnover Kingdom, the land of Dithmarschen lay at the very gateway to the polar wastes known as the Ice Peninsula. Because of this, monsters often appeared, and even the warmth of summer was driven away by the fierce northern winds, leaving it a place where warmth would not linger. It was to this very place that Father Alonso, an elderly man with graying hair, intended to entrust Roberta. As they sat in a lavishly decorated room, Alonso sipped his tea and spoke her name, causing Roberta to choke on her drink in shock as she asked him to pardon her. She looked at him with wide, disbelieving eyes and asked if he truly meant her. Alonso explained that it was a place he knew well, for he once served as its head priest. He noted that though it was humble, with only a small temple in place of a grand cathedral, the appointment of a priest there was done personally by His Holiness. As he went on to describe how the land itself was unlike any he had ever known, explaining that most of the folk lived as nomads and had adopted Eastern cultures, Roberta finally reached her limit and shouted Father Alonso's name. She apologized for her outburst but asked to speak plainly for a moment, setting her teacup down with a clatter. She pointed out that but a month had passed since the head priest of Dithmarschen vanished, leaving the post vacant, and now he was recommending her for the role. She reminded him that she was ordained but 2 years ago, yet Alonso simply replied that it was precisely so, asking if it was not simple. Roberta was incredulous, asking if the first task should not be to seek the missing head priest, but Alonso set his hand firmly on the table and told her not to fret over her predecessor. With a serious expression, he told her that her duty was to head to her new post immediately and fulfill her charge as head priest, asserting that His Holiness would feel no different. Roberta found the entire situation most suspicious, wondering why they would move on as if naught had occurred when a priest appointed by His Holiness had disappeared. She questioned what on earth Alonso was thinking, realizing that by the looks of it, he had already named her successor and was now speaking merely out of courtesy. She sighed, holding her head in her hand as she reflected on how he was ever thus, and asked him of all people why it had to be her. Alonso looked at her kindly and said that it was because she reminded him of himself. Roberta stared at him in confusion, but Alonso laughed, clarifying that he spoke not of outward form. He reminded her that he took her in when her parents abandoned her and ordained her himself. As they had shared many long years together, he believed it was natural they would be alike. He told her that in his youth, he actually fared well as the head priest of Dithmarschen, and he doubted that she would not do the same. Roberta thought back on her childhood, realizing that having been raised by Alonso, she grew up on tales of his adventures rather than fairy tales. Yet, as she traveled toward the distant fortress on horseback, she realized that she had never once heard of his time in Dithmarschen. She looked out over the vast, green plains of the valley and wondered just what he had hidden there. Since matters had come to this, she resolved to discover it for herself, especially since she had heard a certain rumor along the way. As she approached the stone gates of the castle, a guard suddenly leveled his spear at her and commanded her to halt. She stopped her horse, and when asked where she had come from, she raised her hand to reveal a glowing magical mark, declaring that she was a servant of Ganymede who had come to pay respects to the Lord. The guard was surprised to see a priest of Ganymede, and soon a massive, dark-skinned man approached her. He looked up at her and repeated that she was a priest of Ganymede, and Roberta was stunned by his size, noting that even while mounted upon her steed, she was at eye level with him. She wondered if perhaps there ran the blood of giants in him. She introduced herself as Roberta and explained she was sent by Father Alonso, the diocese head of the Nua Grand Temple. The large man was taken aback by the mention of Alonso and asked what her relation was to him. Roberta explained that he was the one who took her in, which the man found to be marvelous news. With a bright smile, he remarked that Father Alonso remained as benevolent as ever and apologized for his tardy introduction. He introduced himself as Bernhard Meyer, though he asked her to call him Bern, and explained that he served the Lord, having received his grace. As they walked, Bern noted that time flies swiftly, recalling that when Father Alonso was there, he was scarcely past 30, and now the hour had come for his successor to take the helm. Roberta nervously interrupted, asking if she could see the Lord first. Bern informed her that unfortunately, the Lord was absent for the moment and would be long in returning, but he offered to show her the temple in the meantime. Roberta's thoughts drifted back to the rumors she had heard, which suggested the Lord of Dithmarschen was no ordinary man. Records told that he succeeded one called Hild and had held the position for a staggering 300 years. Some whispered that he lived so long because he was half human and half elf, but even so, 3 centuries seemed impossible. She reasoned that by now, he should be frail and clinging to life, yet he moved about freely. She asked Bern what the Lord was out doing, and Bern casually replied that he had gone nearby to perform an infant sacrament. Roberta was stunned, knowing that none but a priest may perform the rite. She asked if there was another priest besides the head priest there, but Bern smiled and said no, explaining that the Lord himself would preside. Roberta was horrified, asking if he truly performed it himself despite being an unordained man. She shouted that surely a lord could not ignore the gravity of an infant sacrament, for if the ritual failed, an evil spirit could claim the child. She looked at the calm expressions of the guards and wondered what was wrong with these people, frustrated by their lukewarm reaction and their lack of understanding regarding the peril. She gripped the reins of her horse and shouted that she must see him this instant. She galloped toward the village as the sun began to set, seeing a crowd gathered in the distance. She feared that if the rite had begun, she had to halt it. As she arrived, she heard the loud wails of a newborn. A villager remarked that the child was unharmed, and Roberta pushed through the crowd, frantically asking where the Lord might be. A woman pointed just yonder, and Roberta turned to see a dark-haired man holding the crying infant. As she watched, a brilliant light began to shine from the man's hands. She realized that because mana would not dwell in those who have not received the sacrament, the infant had to undergo it soon after birth so that through a priest, a name could be inscribed in the heavens. She witnessed it plainly as mana seeped from the forehead, settling fully within the child. She was breathless, realizing that the man actually did it. She couldn't understand how it was possible since they said no priest was present, and she wondered who this man truly was. The man gently handed the baby back to its mother and turned his gaze toward Roberta. Noting how she had rushed there, he remarked that it seemed Bern had made another slip of the tongue. Roberta stared at him, her heart racing as she realized that his lifespan of 300 years was beyond imagining. She hesitantly asked if he was perhaps the one she sought. The man looked at her with piercing dark eyes against the golden sunset and confirmed that indeed, he was the Lord of Dithmarschen, Ulrich I. Roberta stared at him, noting that he stood directly in the sun, ruling out the possibility of him being a vampire, and he was far too tall to be a dwarf. Even if he were not human, she realized it should have been impossible for him to maintain such youth at his alleged age. Ulrich broke the silence, remarking that he had thought it was about time she arrived, though he did not expect her to run up there so swiftly. Noticing the chill in the air, he invited her inside to speak over some tea. Inside the warm, circular tent, Ulrich poured a steaming liquid into a bowl for her. Roberta was caught off guard when he addressed her by name, prompting her to ask if he truly knew who she was. He explained that he and Alonso kept in touch from time to time, and the old priest had informed him of his wish to send her as the next head priest. Roberta realized with a start that her arrival had been planned from the beginning. She cautiously sniffed the tea, wondering what kind it was, and Ulrich identified it as Songhua tea, used by the locals. When she pointed out that the Songhua tea she knew did not smell like this, she took a sip and immediately gagged, finding the taste completely different and far more bitter. Ulrich calmly explained that the tea was gathered from mutant pine trees, noting that everything there grew under the influence of the demon realm. Although the roots may have been of the same breed, most things differed slightly from what she was accustomed to. He told her that she was not in a position to be picky about food, suggesting it would be wise to grow used to it. Roberta mentioned that she had heard the weather was barren and bitterly cold, yet now that she was there, it did not seem as harsh as she had imagined. Ulrich noted that the climate only began improving a few years past, with the temperature rising regardless of the season. He mused that it might be a sign that the Little Ice Age was drawing to an end. When Roberta repeated the term with curiosity, he asked if she understood how historical eras were commonly divided. She confirmed she did, explaining that the span from the rise of an empire to its fall was counted as one era. Ulrich agreed that such was the human standard, pointing out that they currently dwelt in the third era. He held up 2 fingers, explaining that 2 empires had fallen and the current one now stood. He revealed that the Little Ice Age began near the collapse of the Second Empire, resembling the ancient Ice Age, though the drop in temperature was not as severe. He added that the elves and he took to calling it the Little Ice Age to distinguish it from the true one. Roberta fell into a deep silence, calculating that it had been 1400 years since the Second Empire fell and the Jocasta dynasty was established. She realized with mounting dread that he spoke as though he had lived through those times, wondering who the man before her truly was. Ulrich sensed her wandering thoughts and asked if that was the question she pondered. Roberta admitted that Alonso told her nothing, but the rumors claimed the Lord was a half-elf who had dwelt there for 300 years. Ulrich repeated the number and mused if that much time had already passed. He then sought to clarify one matter, stating firmly that he was not a half-blood, but purely human. Roberta was stunned, finding it hard to believe since a half-blood might at least explain his slow aging. Ulrich insisted there was no falsehood in his words but said he had no desire to force belief upon her. He offered counsel, suggesting it was not always wise to overthink matters and that she should observe, for the answers would reveal themselves in time. He reminded her that she had just been appointed head priest. As 2 children peeked through the door, Ulrich ended their discussion, noting that the others were awaiting him. Roberta watched as he stood to finish the officiating of the day's ceremony, telling her she could take charge from the next time onward. He looked back at her with a calm expression, saying he looked forward to working with her. As the ceremony continued outside, the narrative reflected on how the dream of immortality persisted in every age, born of the arrogant desire to reach God and the pure instinct to clutch what one held. Yet fate allowed it not, leaving mortals to live their days grateful merely to exist. Ulrich explained to the villagers that the infant sacrament carried a deeper meaning, signifying that one had endured the harsh land long enough to receive it. Roberta watched from the shadows, sighing as she thought the etiquette was a complete mess and wondering how the sacrament could even function in such disorder. An elderly man approached her, offering her a drink of wine to warm her body. Roberta thanked him, though she secretly wondered if it would taste as weird as the tea. After taking a large gulp, she was shocked to find it remarkably delicious. The old man smiled, revealing that the wine had been aged for no fewer than 60 years. He explained that it was a gift he received from Lord Ulrich when he was but a child. He recalled a day he went hunting with his father and uncle, chasing prey deep into the forest and drawing the attention of a monster. The adults were injured while shielding him, yet he somehow managed to lift both onto a sled and ran forward without looking back. Lord Ulrich had declared that his courage saved them all and bestowed the wine upon him. The boy, wishing to drink the meaningful wine at the end of his life, had entrusted it back to Lord Ulrich. Today, 60 years later, the Lord had at last returned it to him. The old man told Roberta that while he understood why she found the Lord suspicious, the people of the land lived their lives beneath the gaze of that unchanging figure from birth until their final breath. He asked her to regard him with an open mind. She wondered if Father Alonso felt this way on his first day and if understanding would come with time. She looked toward Ulrich as he stood by a fire, still pondering his true identity. Meanwhile, inside the fortress, a man addressed the Lord, stating he had heard Ulrich lived a long life approaching immortality. He begged for help, hoping Ulrich might know something of his son's curse. Roberta, eavesdropping from the shadows, was startled by the word. The man presented a hooded child, explaining that the boy beside him should be fully grown with children of his own, yet he remained young. As the boy's hood fell, a glowing orange eye stared out, and the air grew heavy with the revelation that since the day he returned from death once, all had changed. A little over a week had passed since her arrival, and Roberta sat at a wooden desk, her pen scratching against the parchment as she wrote to Father Alonso. She explained that from the very day she came, she began her duties as head priest, noting that since the disappearance of her predecessor, the parish had fallen into some disorder. To restore it swiftly, she selected acolytes and carried out the backlog of sacraments, but she admitted to letting things slide during the last ritual. Standing before a towering stained glass mural within the temple, she confronted Ulrich, insisting they ought to discuss proper sacrament etiquette. She questioned why he did not prepare incense and anointing oil at the very least. Ulrich simply asked why, a response that left Roberta stunned and asking what he could possibly mean. She pointed out that such things were the proper etiquette for honoring Lord Hestio, the adopted son of the goddess Ganymede. The mural depicted Hestio as a mortal taken into the care of the goddess herself, who one day, while dwelling among the gods in the heavens, spied a group of humans shivering upon the cold earth. Taking pity, he descended and offered them fire, and from that hour forth, humans began to follow him, regarding him as both father and god. Whenever they held a ritual, they would kindle a fire and honor him by creating smoke from the extinguished flame. However, Ulrich countered with a cold look, stating that saying they honored him was mistaken, and that calling upon him would be more precise. Roberta remarked that he was speaking strange things again, but Ulrich continued as he held a lit candle, explaining that the reason they light the fire and then extinguish it is to summon Hestio. He claimed that when the flame dies, Hestio descends and relights it himself, having done so every time in the past to spare humans the trouble. Roberta noted that he possessed an uncanny knowledge of these details and asked if he had met Lord Hestio himself. Ulrich ignored the question, stating that all this etiquette began from a misconception because the gods never instructed humans in such matters, so it could not possibly aid the sacraments. When Roberta reminded him that she was a priest, he placed his hand on the table and told her not to fret, as he remembered well enough. He leaned in close, telling her that for the record, he told Alonso precisely the same thing. Roberta was left speechless, knowing that Father Alonso had never said aught of the sort. Ulrich mused that it was unavoidable, as they dwelt in the land of the one-eyed. Later, as she continued her letter, Roberta admitted that she was not particularly devout, perhaps due to her skeptical nature. However, she found herself gripping her pen tightly as she thought of how even she followed customs without questioning the rituals. She felt it was a wonder that no one had reported him for heresy to this day. Even when she endeavored to investigate the Lord a bit more, the people only spoke of him with praise. A villager with his child on his shoulders told her the legend of how he felled a great giant and visited the nest of a sleeping dragon, while a woman described him as a man of great refinement. Roberta realized the people there treated him as a god, a fact that made her feel like a complete outsider and left her wondering if she could truly adapt to this place for the next 10 years. She felt yet more discomfort because she was lodged in the Lord's manor, having no choice since the temple quarters were in poor condition. Though she supposed he let her stay out of consideration, it remained an uncomfortable cohabitation with a suspicious lord. As she walked through the dark stone hallways of the manor, she spotted a massive man and an elderly, hooded figure. She wondered if the place actually received visitors in such rugged terrain and watched as they headed toward the Lord's office. Inside, Ulrich sat at his desk as the visitors entered, noting that they were seeking him. The elderly man, a one-eyed traveler, explained that he had heard tales of the Lord and came to seek him out because of his 300-year life. Ulrich asked if the reason behind his agelessness was what they came to find, but the man, whose name was Rashid, stated that his purpose was different. Rashid revealed he came from the kingdom of Ararik and sought Ulrich because he thought the Lord might know something of his son's curse. Roberta, watching from the shadows of the doorway, was startled by the mention of a curse. Ulrich asked the man how old he was, and Rashid replied he was 67, having fathered the boy when he was 21. He spoke with honesty, noting that the child was of an age where he should be fully grown with children of his own, yet from the day he returned from death once, all had changed. Roberta was shocked, wondering if the child had truly died and come back to life. Rashid confirmed it was an accident where the boy drowned in a stream. His wife and he had confirmed the passing and held a funeral, but not long after, screams echoed from the grave. They hastily dug it up to find him crying within, but from that day forward, the child ceased to grow and his mind regressed to that of an infant. Rashid explained that in his culture, they bury the dead entirely intact so they may travel to the afterlife, but his son could not. He believed the boy was cursed by the gods and could not pass on, returning to the world in this state because he had insulted the gods when he was 8. Ulrich told him to cease his lies, pointing out that Ararik was a distant country in the east. He questioned how the man traveled all the way from there just to see him, noting that outside of Osnover, few knew of him. He surmised that the man merely wandered, heard rumors, and came. Ulrich argued that sicknesses and curses could be healed by priests, mages, or alchemists, and if none of them could fix it, then it was no curse. With a cold gaze, he asked Rashid to pray tell the truth and reveal what exactly he did to the child. A memory from 30 years ago surfaced of a chaotic battle where soldiers pushed through opening gates. Amidst the sounds of clashing steel and war cries, a soldier shouted for Rashid, relaying the boss's orders to infiltrate the premises and capture an old man. He explained that while he did not know the details, the target was supposedly an alchemist researching immortality. Rashid made his way into the interior, finding the place completely empty. He wondered if the man had already fled, noting that such an outcome would be most troublesome. As he entered a cluttered laboratory, his eyes fell upon a boiling cauldron of green liquid and various glowing vials. He mused that in his haste, the alchemist had not even extinguished the fire. As Rashid reached for a glowing vial, a voice suddenly roared, commanding him not to touch that with his filthy hands. A hooded figure lunged at him, and before Rashid could react, a blinding light erupted. He realized with terror that the light was mana. A massive explosion shattered the room, sending debris flying and filling the air with thick smoke. Through the haze, Rashid coughed and struggled to his feet, his face now scarred from the blast. He saw the cloaked figure trembling on the floor. The alchemist let out a desperate cry of no, reaching for a precious vial. He muttered about curses as he crawled across the wooden floor. Rashid, fueled by pain and duty, drew his blade and lunged forward, stabbing the young man through the chest. The alchemist gasped in agony as the blade found its mark. Standing over the body, Rashid watched as the alchemist's cloak caught fire. It was only then that he realized the truth. The young man he slew was that very alchemist. Later, as he sat with his face bandaged, a fellow soldier questioned the orders, asking if they hadn't clearly said he was an old man. The comrade surmised that the alchemist likely slowed his aging, meaning he was indeed that close to achieving immortality. Rashid wondered if the man might have succeeded had he not been slain. His comrade spoke solemnly, stating that historically, among the fools who pursued immortality, none have succeeded nor met a proper end. He claimed the pursuit of such things leads only to a miserable death. He told Rashid to worry not over slaying the alchemist, as the boss would soon forget his fleeting delusion. Though Rashid grasped his meaning, he could not bring himself to discard the alchemist's elixir. The glowing red vial filled him with a strange faith, not born of greed, but of the thought that it might be sold for a handsome sum. Yet, right after that, his son was met with misfortune. Rashid was compelled to do whatever was needed, and as he held his dying son, he believed that if it be this elixir, it might restore him. He administered the red liquid into the boy's mouth, but the child did not revive at once. Thinking him dead, he laid him in the earth, yet one day, screams began to leak from his grave. Rashid recounted to Ulrich that all that followed was as he had described, noting that his wife and he never gave up and continued to care for their son. Yet before his wife passed, she said that their son seemed not to be their son. In the present, the childlike being suddenly lunged forward, biting Rashid's hand with feral intensity. Roberta gasped from the shadows as Rashid groaned in pain, his blood dripping onto the floor as the creature scurried away to eat a fallen apple. Ulrich spoke with a cold tone, stating that he could scarce imagine the trials Rashid endured to reach this place. He noted that none could discern the cause of this affliction, and Rashid must have heard only the grim conclusion that his son could not be healed. Ulrich asked if Rashid still believed this thing to be his child. Rashid, his hands trembling as he bandaged his wound, replied that even if he behaved as a beast, he bore the form of his son, and he asked how a parent could deny their own child. Ulrich sighed with pity, stating that as Rashid's wife had said, that was not his son and was never alive to begin with. Rashid was stunned, asking what he meant, but Ulrich declared that only one path remained. With a swift motion, Ulrich gripped the hilt of a dagger and drew it. Roberta's eyes widened in horror and she shouted for him to wait, rushing from the shadows. But the situation spiraled out of control as blood splattered across the stone floor. Rashid coughed, a crimson trail escaping his lips, while Ulrich stood with a chillingly calm expression, blood staining his own mouth. He noted with a cold voice that he expected as much from a soldier of Ararik. Rashid, despite his injuries, managed to draw another hidden blade, clutching it tightly as he apologized to the Lord, claiming he had no other choice. The tension in the room shattered as Roberta charged forward, her footsteps echoing against the walls. Rashid's eyes widened as he realized the priestess was there, wondering if she had overheard their entire conversation. He cursed his luck, deciding in a moment of desperation that he could not leave any witnesses alive. He swung his blade at Roberta with lethal intent, forcing her to dodge the heavy blow. She barely had time to breathe before he followed up with a powerful strike, but she stood her ground, drawing her own dagger to defend herself. Rashid groaned in pain as the two clashed, and suddenly, the creature that once resembled a child let out a deafening, inhuman scream. Roberta rushed toward the Lord, frantically asking if he was all right, her mind racing with the intent to use healing magic. As the half-eaten apple tumbled to the floor, the creature turned its feral gaze on her, screaming in a voice that held no humanity. Roberta's breath hitched as the boy lunged at her, his movements a blur of unnatural speed. She held her dagger ready but hesitated, the words of Ulrich echoing in her mind. He had warned her that this was not a son and had never been alive to begin with, but she looked at the child's face and wondered if that could truly be so. She questioned how Ulrich could be so certain when the creature fully resembled a human boy. The creature's mouth unhinged, revealing rows of jagged, predator-like teeth as it pinned her down. Rashid lay broken on the floor, groaning in agony as he watched the nightmare unfold. Just as the creature prepared to tear into her, Ulrich moved with impossible grace, calling out her name. He allowed the monster to sink its teeth into his own neck, remaining completely unfazed. He told her calmly that it was naught but an empty husk and commanded her not to falter. Even as the creature fed on him, Ulrich's gaze remained dark and steady. Roberta felt a surge of divine power and called upon Ganymede, her blade erupting in a brilliant blue light. She swung with all her might, praying for the goddess to smite the sins born of ignorance and barbarism. The blade sliced through the monster's arm, but instead of bone and blood, a mass of writhing red vines burst from the wound. Roberta's eyes widened as she realized the horrifying truth, seeing that those vines were the only thing filling the child's form. She struck again, her anger flaring as she asked how a mere monster dared to pretend to be human. She shouted for Rashid to look well at the true form of the thing he called his son. The creature collapsed to the ground, a thick, black ichor pooling beneath it. Roberta noticed that even with its arm severed, not a drop of real blood flowed, and it seemed to feel no pain at all. She realized that the only way to end it was to strike at its core. However, before she could move, the creature lunged one last time, latching onto Ulrich's throat. Roberta cried out for him, her voice trembling as she asked how he could endure such a wound. Ulrich simply stood there, his neck covered in dark stains, and spoke a single word of acknowledgement. Rashid watched in disbelief as the blood splattered across the room began to move on its own. The crimson droplets defied gravity, flowing through the air and pulling back into Ulrich's body. Roberta was frozen in shock, unable to comprehend how such a thing was possible. Ulrich's eyes glowed with an eerie light as the wounds on his neck sealed shut. He looked at her and revealed that this was precisely the reason he had been able to live for so long. Roberta looked at Ulrich in disbelief, her mind racing with the memory of how he was recently struck through the stomach and had his neck torn open. It would not have been strange if he had died from such lethal wounds, yet she watched in awe as the blood returned to his body. She wondered how on earth he yet lived, noting that she had never heard of healing magic that could draw blood backward, nor of wounds that could close without leaving so much as a scar. She turned her attention to the defeated Rashid, who knelt on the floor in despair. The elderly man looked up with a hollow gaze, his voice trembling as he addressed the Lord and asked if his son had already died a long time ago. Ulrich looked down at him and confirmed that it was so, and that the child had passed away at the time of the original accident. When Rashid asked what the creature currently was, Ulrich explained it was naught but a creature wrought by an alchemist, a parasite that dwelt within a host. He revealed that the elixir required time to take root and seize control of the body. The thing that took his son's corpse as its vessel merely used what memories remained, and its actions were born of an instinct to survive. Ulrich clarified that when the creature heard Rashid's cry and turned violent, it was not to protect the father, but to preserve its own shield. Rashid lowered his head in silence, finally admitting that in the end, his wife was right. Ulrich pressed further, asking if it was not just his wife who saw the truth, suggesting that surely among those he met, someone must have said the same thing as the Lord. He questioned if Rashid drew his blade each time they spoke the truth and told him that the child was not alive and must be killed. In the end, the man had protected something that was not his son. Ulrich stated that Rashid could not accept his son's death and chose to defy the natural order, committing countless sins by killing numerous people just to turn his gaze from the truth. He noted that to undo a single misstep, the man had wrought far too many sacrifices. Rashid wept, confessing that it was all due to his foolishness and it was his own sin. He gripped his face and cried, mourning his poor child whose body was stolen by a monster. With a final plea, he asked if his son suffered even after death because of him, and if his soul found its way to the afterlife in peace. Ulrich remained silent for a moment before telling Rashid to hear him well. He declared that there was no afterlife, and that there was only this harsh world and the end they call death. Therefore, he assured the broken man that his son did not suffer. Rashid was later handed over to the guards, destined to face a just judgment when his trial came. It was a reckoning for the deaths he fled from. Yet, even after all that transpired, life in Dithmarschen remained as quiet as ever. Roberta overheard the maids talking by the washbasins, simply noting that the Lord was attacked and that was all. She marveled at how the office had been drenched in blood, yet no one else seemed troubled by it. She began to understand that when one beheld a man who was himself an anomaly each day, even an assassination attempt seemed mundane. Ulrich eventually called out to her, sensing there was much she wished to ask of him. Roberta was startled, asking why he mentioned it all of a sudden. He noted that it was written plainly upon her face and told her to ask what she would, as her thoughts must be in disarray. He listed her likely questions, such as how he knew the child's true nature or how he yet lived, asking if none of that troubled her. Roberta claimed she was fine, though internally she was consumed by curiosity. She reflected on his statement that there was no afterlife, a claim that bore a weight far greater than any sacrament he performed. As a priestess, she knew she ought to question him, as the scriptures taught that upon death, souls were divided between the virtuous in heaven and the wicked in hell. The notion of an afterlife granted solace to countless souls, yet this man denied such words. She felt that his words did not ring of falsehood or deceit, which was why she dared not ask further. For her, the truth he held might be more than she could bear, threatening to shatter all she knew. She decided that for now, she would not seek it. Ulrich smiled slightly, remarking that as he thought, she resembled Alonso. He recalled that Alonso, whom he called that child, was also very curious yet cautious in what he chose to ask. He mused that those who remained by his side the longest were all much the same, noting that Hild too asked only at the very end. Roberta wondered about the previous lord, Hild, but Ulrich continued, stating that while it meant little to him, they were all so careful. He looked at Roberta and said he had a sense that she would remain there a long while. She looked at his face, which seemed no older than her own, yet she began to see the weight of years upon it little by little. She realized she had grown accustomed to his presence. As winter drew toward its end and a single sprout pushed through the snow, the Lord, for reasons unknown, did not open his eyes for some time. He remained still, as though he had fallen into an endless slumber. Ulrich's eyes fluttered open as he lay upon a bed of furs, hearing a soft rustling nearby. A young girl with short dark hair stood over him, clutching a bouquet of colorful spring flowers, and her eyes widened in shock as she realized he was awake. Startled by his sudden movement, she let out a small cry and called out for her daddy. Ulrich sat up slowly, rubbing his temple as he looked around the interior of a gyre belonging to the Bard tribe. He realized that winter had passed while he was asleep, and he reached out to touch a delicate blue flower the girl had left behind. A bearded man named Kurt entered the tent, welcoming him back and stating that he had been waiting for the Lord to awaken. Ulrich cleared his throat and addressed Kurt, noting that the weather seemed quite nice outside. Kurt agreed, mentioning that spring was already in full swing as he poured a drink from a leather flask. When Ulrich asked how long he had slept, Kurt informed him that a little over a month had passed. He reminded the Lord how he had come to hunt monsters in the area toward the end of winter and stopped by their tribe, only to fall into a deep slumber after entering the gyre to rest. Kurt noted that this time was actually quite short, recalling a year when he served as a page at the castle and Ulrich had fallen asleep for over a year. Roberta, the red-haired priestess, stood nearby with her arms crossed and a look of deep annoyance. She told him it was nothing to worry about, but then admitted she was shocked because he had been lying there like a cadaver. Ulrich offered a calm apology, explaining that from her perspective it must have been shocking, but it simply happened to him on occasion. Roberta was baffled, questioning what on earth he meant by saying it happens, and Ulrich explained that sometimes in life, a sudden wave of boredom washes over him and he falls into a deep slumber. He told her to think of it as hibernation, which left Roberta massaging her temple in frustration. She sighed and admitted she had never seen anyone else sleep in such a manner. Ulrich noted that he heard that often and asked if anything significant had happened in the meantime. Kurt bowed respectfully and left the two to chat, mentioning that Sir Bernhard had handled the work perfectly. Ulrich remarked that he had raised Bern since he was a child and had no worries, but then shifted his focus to Roberta, asking how she had been doing as the head priest. Roberta looked away, admitting the parish was in a pitiful state and that restoring it had been a hurdle, but she insisted it was her responsibility and he need not worry. Ulrich sipped his drink and observed that she must have sought him out for another reason. She confirmed his suspicion, revealing that guests had arrived in Dithmarschen looking for a guide to find a dragon on the ice peninsula. As they later rode their horses through the vibrant green hills, Ulrich spoke of ancient times when the world was covered in fire. He explained that the gods drew water from another dimension to make the soil fertile and began to mold creations upon the land. First and foremost, they bestowed a name and intelligence upon a four-legged lizard known as Ruobidra, the progenitor of dragons. Roberta noted that such a story was not written in the scriptures, but Ulrich pointed out that human myths and history belonged solely to humans. He explained that while humans passed their tales from generation to generation, there were only a few dragons left who were destined for extinction. He mused that in this era, they did not have the luxury to care about a fading race, and thus they became forgotten beings. Back at the manor, Ulrich sat with his hands clasped as he met with the foreign travelers. The lead guest, a man with red hair and a thick beard, stared at him with a skeptical eye and asked if he was truly the Lord of Dithmarschen. He admitted he had heard the Lord was an elderly man who had lived for over 300 years. Ulrich confirmed he had been the Lord for about that long, though he noted he was clearly no elderly man. Roberta raised her hand, her blue crest glowing with divine light as she guaranteed that this man was indeed Lord Ulrich, the master of Dithmarschen. The guest was taken aback and introduced himself as Count Bellido of Motrilda from the kingdom of Carbonihar. He bowed his head and asked for forgiveness for his rudeness, noting that it was impossible to guess Ulrich's age from his appearance. Ulrich held no grudge, stating it happened quite often, and asked the count to get back to the point. Bellido explained they had received information that the dragon they sought, Narvakeani, had nested on the ice peninsula. He described it as a dragon with pure white, translucent scales. Ulrich touched his chin thoughtfully and confirmed that the information was accurate, as Narvakeani was indeed there. However, he warned the group that they would not be able to find a guide to go with them because it was too dangerous. Bellido insisted they were aware of the risks and the demon realm's influence, offering handsome compensation and even more escorts. Ulrich countered that adding more people would only increase the number of casualties. He then pointed a finger directly at the man, commanding him not to make others speak for him and to ask directly. His gaze pierced through the traveler as he identified him as the true leader of the group. Roberta stammered, asking what he was talking about, but Ulrich continued with a steady gaze, noting it was obvious the moment he saw the man that he was a descendant of Benares. The red-haired man tried to deny the claim, calling it absurd. Finally, the true master relented, admitting that the other man only sat there on his behalf and following orders. He revealed himself as a hero of the kingdom of Carbonihar, a descendant of King Benares, and the Duke of Talamanca, Valinio. Valinio noted that no one had ever recognized him until now and asked how Ulrich knew. Ulrich explained that he could see the Benares in his face, though he admitted his memory was a bit hazy. Valinio was perplexed, noting that Ulrich spoke as though he had met the man himself, which should be impossible since the Lord was only past his 300th year. To have met Benares, he would have had to be born centuries earlier. Ulrich's expression grew shadowed as he revealed that when he met Benares, he was not yet Ulrich of Dithmarschen. The travelers found the idea of him being older than 300 years to be absurd. Valinio challenged him, asking what name he used back then when they met. Ulrich paused to think back, mentioning names like Ganian, Lanier, and Stein-Louise, before recalling that he once combined the names of Rosenberg and Braustein to call himself Rosenstein. Roberta watched him with growing shock as he continued, remembering that he served under a noble in the land of Villeneuve using the name Laurent. Valinio's eyes widened in disbelief as Ulrich asked if that was it. The Duke realized the impossible was true, slamming his hands onto the table as he shouted that Ulrich was Laurent all along. He had thought the stories were just his grandfather's wild tales, but Ulrich noted that he must have heard a thing or two from Benares. Valinio recalled his grandfather saying that those who lived long lives eventually crossed paths. Roberta calculated the ages in her head, realizing that if Valinio was the grandson of a man who lived centuries ago, then the Duke himself must be at least a few hundred years old. Ulrich noted that they came all the way to the polar region in search of a dragon and asked Valinio if he had dragon's blood in his veins. As a massive shadow loomed over the room, a small boy entered, carrying a heavy tome that hit the table with a dull thud. Ulrich thanked the child and put on his glasses, much to Roberta's surprise. He explained that the book was a bestiary he compiled himself after observing the local monsters. He flipped through the pages to show Valinio the creatures of the Ice Peninsula, starting with a creature that released hallucinogenic pollen. The illustrations depicted a terrifying plant that ensnared targets with its stem and stuffed them into fruit-like pods filled with corrosive fluid. Another monster, a purple multi-eyed spider, impaled the skin to lay hundreds of eggs that would hatch and eat the host from the inside out. Ulrich warned that there was a reason they called the Ice Peninsula the Demon Realm. As the travelers argued, Ulrich removed his glasses and explained that a long time ago, a war between fairies and dwarves twisted the flow of mana and warped the local flora and fauna. Because of this, guides only went to the safer areas and refused to venture past where the dragon Narvakeani dwelt. He asked the Duke if he would still go without a guide and what he intended to do if they actually met him. Valinio grew solemn, admitting that while some envied his blood since he could live as long as a Fae, it was a hollow gift. As a dragon hybrid, he could not leave descendants, and his mother had returned to the soil centuries ago. He felt more distant from his clan than from strangers, realizing that no matter how long he lived, there was nothing he could leave behind and no one stayed by his side. Ulrich gently noted that blood was not the only thing one could leave behind. Valinio smiled sadly, saying he knew Ulrich would say that and that their existence was thanks to people like him. However, he admitted he was not as strong as the Lord. Born a half-breed, he was entangled in his bloodline, and the only connection he had left was his father. Although they had never met, he knew his father remembered his mother, and he simply wished to meet him and talk. Ulrich stared into his eyes, asking if that was truly his only wish. Valinio confirmed it was and fell to his knees, begging the Lord to show him the same mercy he once showed his grandfather. Ulrich looked toward Roberta and asked if she was used to the cold yet. Roberta, with dark circles under her eyes and a weary expression, admitted she was only just getting used to the chill of Dithmarschen. Ulrich laughed softly, noting that the coming journey would not be easy for her. He finally agreed to take the Duke if that was truly his wish, but he gave a final, stern warning. He declared that on the Ice Peninsula, they must do exactly as he said, or they would all die. Roberta looked out at the freezing, snow-covered mountains with a face full of dread as the winds howled around them. The freezing winds of the Ice Peninsula howled across the jagged mountain peaks as Ulrich waded through the waist-deep snow. He noticed Roberta lagging behind, her face pale and her eyes losing focus. Sudden panic flared in the air as the red-haired priestess collapsed into the white powder, prompting Ulrich to shout her name. He caught her just before she hit the ground and asked if she was awake. He told her to get up slowly and assured her he would hold on to her. When he asked if she was about to lose consciousness, Roberta breathlessly confirmed she was. Ulrich held up a wriggling, translucent parasite he had pulled from her head, explaining that the thing had been clinging to her until just now. He revealed that these creatures traveled with the wind and targeted the heads of animals, secreting a substance that caused hallucinations. He noted it wasn't as bad as it could have been because she was wearing a hat, but warned that she must be especially careful in cliff areas where carelessness meant instant death. As the snow continued to fall, the group made it to a cave where Ulrich decided they would spend the night. Valinio and Bolito shivered in their furs, and the Duke noted they would begin descending the mountain in 2 days, which would make the walking easier. Roberta asked how he knew a cave like this existed there, and Ulrich replied that he had found it a long time ago and stopped by occasionally. Ulrich picked up some branches and stated they should light a fire. Roberta questioned if he truly found dry wood in the snow, noting she could not let him freeze to death, but pointed out the wood was completely wet. Ulrich ignored the doubt, holding the logs in his hands as they began to glow and hum with mana. Roberta was stunned, asking if he was drying the firewood with mana. Ulrich confirmed he was. She mentioned she had been curious for a while and asked if he had mastered magic. He humbly replied that he knew a few tricks and that it was a basic requirement when he was born. Roberta observed his refined mana flow, thinking that for someone who only knew a few tricks, he was far beyond her. She admitted that perhaps because of her abundance of mana, her own power just burst out all at once, making delicate work impossible. She asked if he learned from Alonso, but Ulrich laughed and said that kid never really had a knack for teaching others. Ulrich offered to help her try, telling her to give it a go right now. Roberta was hesitant, but he assured her he had taught Alonso too and told her to trust him. He explained that mana was the realm of sensation and that if she didn't do it herself, she would never know the feeling. He instructed her to open the door very carefully and blow mana into the firewood to push the moisture out, promising he would absorb any excess. Roberta focused intently, her hands glowing as the wood began to hiss and dry. She shouted with joy that she did it. Ulrich told her to remember the feeling and practice often, as repetition was the path to mastery. Valinio looked on and remarked that Ulrich was a good teacher, noting his grandfather always used to talk about the Lord's lessons. Ulrich dismissed the praise as merely entertainment, stating there was nothing as fun as raising a talented child. He recalled that Benares was like that too, being very talented, which was why he was able to rise to his position. Valinio added that his grandfather always said it was all thanks to the Lord, but Ulrich shook his head and said he only showed them the direction, while moving forward was up to the child. Roberta poured a cup of Songhua tea for Count Bolito, telling him it would warm him up. He thanked her but noted the unique smell. Roberta realized it had been a while since the Lord and Duke went outside. Ulrich announced he was going to look around for edible things, noting that jerky and biscuits weren't enough to fill their stomachs. Valinio offered to accompany him, and Roberta tried to join, but Ulrich told her to stay and look after the guests. He asked her to melt some snowballs to make more tea, saying that would be a great help. Left alone with the Count, Roberta asked what kind of person Benares was. Belito realized she was curious about the relationship between the Great King and the Lord. He began to recount a famous story from the Carbonihar kingdom about 4 guests who appeared and saved King Benares during 4 crises before he ascended the throne. He described the year the king turned 10, when his father was brutally murdered by rebels. The rebels reached for young Benares to root out the seeds of revenge, but a knight staying at the palace as a guest saved him. That knight's name was Laurent de Villeneuve, and he was the first guest. Thanks to him fighting off 6 generals alone for 48 days, the prince was able to safely flee to a neighboring country. However, 8 years later, a crisis struck once again. The rebels chased the prince and even invaded the neighboring country. Great King Benares fought back until the very end, but was ultimately defeated. And so, locked in a carriage, he was dragged back to the Carbonihar kingdom. There, the second guest appeared. There was a hunter staying in the city where the escort stopped briefly. He recognized the prince locked in the carriage and helped him escape in the middle of the night. To shake off the escort, they then crossed a forest inhabited by a mad witch. The Count noted that the situations with the third and fourth guests were similar. When the prince was nearly executed after being framed for attempting a coup, an unknown priest brought evidence of his innocence. Later, when Benares fell into a state of suspended animation for years due to a poisoning attempt, an alchemist from a neighboring country brought an antidote. Having survived these 4 critical moments, Great King Benares eventually brought down the usurper and ascended to the throne. After that, he ruled over the kingdom of Carbonihar until the age of 90. Roberta asked what happened to those guests in the end. Belito replied that it was said all 4 of them left without receiving any reward. Once the Great King ascended the throne, he distributed public proclamations far and wide to find his saviors. However, there was something unusual. What was written on the proclamations was not the saviors' names or descriptions, but rather messages of gratitude and blessings meant for them. Roberta wondered if those could be letters for them, and Belito agreed that perhaps that was the case. As the fire crackled between them, Roberta stared into the flames, a sudden thought striking her as she asked what if those 4 guests were all the same person. Belito was visibly surprised by her question. He admitted he did not think so either until coming here, but Duke Valinio believed that to be the case. The Duke was certain that all 4 saviors were the Lord of Dithmarschen. When she asked if he trusted the Duke's judgment, Belito confirmed he did because the Duke was a descendant of Great King Benares and his suzerain. He explained it was not just him, and though each of their circumstances was different, they were all indebted to him for life. Whether it was his beliefs or his journey, they intended to follow him to the very end. Before long, Ulrich and Valinio returned with something hefty in a sack. When Roberta asked what it was, they simply said it was meat, though as to what kind it was, they chose not to answer. 2 days later, they finally left the mountains and descended to the plains. The group walked through a snowy forest, perhaps letting their guard down while walking on a much easier path than before. One of the vassals following Count Belito, a man named Igor, briefly broke away from the group. Suddenly, his foot triggered something beneath the snow, and a massive, stone-like limb erupted from the earth, crushing the man instantly. Belito screamed for Igor, but the air was filled with a terrifying crunch of bone. Valinio shouted in a panic as the creature, a massive golem-like mountain beast, began its assault. The ground shattered with every movement of the monster. Ulrich rushed forward, grabbing Roberta and telling her to look after him and make sure no one else came down there. The monster's massive stone fist slammed into Ulrich, pinning him beneath a crushing weight. Blood splattered across the white snow as the impact shook the very foundation of the earth. Valinio tried to charge down to help, but Roberta caught him, shouting that he could not go down there. She insisted that the Lord would not die, leaving the Duke confused and asking what she was talking about. She watched the sight of the massacre with a grim expression, whispering to herself that he was going to come back just like back then. Slowly, the blood that had been scattered across the snow began to glow and gather in the center of the impact crater. It flowed backward through the air, defying gravity as it merged back into a single point. A hand suddenly burst through the snow, and Ulrich pulled himself out, coughing and gasping. His clothes were shredded and he was covered in blood, but the lethal wounds on his body were already vanishing. The Duke rushed to him, frantically asking if he was all right. Ulrich, holding the broken body of the vassal, apologized to Valinio, stating he could not save him. Valinio told him that Belito would not have survived if it was not for him and that they should be thanking him rather than making him apologize. The Duke watched as Ulrich's arms shimmered with a fading mana glow. Ulrich dismissed his concern, telling him to worry not and that although it hurt quite a bit, it would not be a problem. He looked at the group with a cold, steady gaze and told them they were the ones causing troubles. He noted that they had all let their guard down after making it out of that harsh terrain, but warned that they were not the only ones who found the place livable. On the contrary, he explained that there were more monsters nesting there than in the snowy mountains, making the area even more hazardous. He declared that this was where the demon realm truly began. He warned that if they did not stay sharp, another disaster could strike, reminding them that he could not save everyone on his own. Belito bowed his head and promised he would. With the loss of one of their own, the atmosphere instantly sank. Roberta looked toward the dark, monster-infested woods with a face full of dread, praying that this would be the final sacrifice of their journey. However, just as the Lord warned, that was only the beginning. At the Duke's request, Roberta led a prayer for the dead before the group departed. Since monsters would swarm once night fell, the ritual was kept brief, for no matter how many farewells they experienced, the journey had to continue. Another day passed, and another person died. While the Lord and the priestess were away, a man stepped outside to handle some business and met a silent end, his torch left burning in the snow. 3 days later, they were attacked by a monstrous bird with vibrant green plumage and massive curved horns. The group struggled against the beast, and the next day, another man lost a leg to the perils of the trail. After 14 days had passed like that, Roberta looked out at the jagged, frozen peaks and asked the Lord of Dithmarschen if that was the place. Ulrich confirmed it was, noting that Narvakeani had made his lair somewhere in those mountains. Roberta worriedly asked if they had to climb up there and search for him, but Ulrich assured her that it wouldn't happen. As they trekked through the desolate frost, they came upon the ruins of a stone tower. Roberta paused, wondering why a building like this would be on the ice peninsula. As the wind whistled through the broken masonry, Valinio looked at the ancient walls and asked if that was writing he saw. Roberta agreed it seemed to be, but when she asked the Duke if he could read it, he admitted he could not at all. Ulrich approached the wall and revealed it was some sort of last will, translating the haunting message which stated that they were now dying. When Roberta asked if it was the language of the elves or dwarves from the war he had mentioned, Ulrich replied that it was not. He explained that the masters of this tower were neither dwarves nor elves, but humans who tried to found their own nation as the era of dwarves was coming to an end and the era of elves was beginning to rise. It was a trace of human civilization that failed to survive. As they gathered around a fire inside the ruins, Ulrich explained that the ice peninsula was originally divided into an island and the mainland. However, towards the end of the war, the elves dragged the island to the mainland and merged them together to stop the dwarves who were resisting from their island stronghold. As a result, the flow of mana became distorted. Roberta was stunned by the revelation, struggling to imagine an entire island being dragged across the sea. Ulrich noted it was that kind of era when this civilization lived, a time when even the flow of mana could be twisted, and humans were merely caught in the conflict and lost their lives. He asked her how she thought it became possible that those fragile humans had now begun to lead the era. Roberta replied that according to the scriptures, it was thanks to Lord Hestio. She described the era of gods where all things were born under heavenly power and lived in peace, but it soon came to an end. The gods left the heavens, and only endless chaos and violence remained on earth. Before leaving, the gods urged Hestio to depart with them, but he chose to remain on earth with his kin. The humans, raised in Hestio's embrace, harbored their own ideals and set off on various paths, but they could not overcome the currents of the era and all met an unjust end, just like the masters of the tower. Overcome with sorrow, Hestio gathered all the remaining humans into a single group and made one person their master to build a civilization. That was the first empire and the first emperor. In the end, those who firmly united under the absolute power of the throne came to possess a power greater than any other race had, and that was how humans succeeded in establishing history. Ulrich then asked if she remembered Ruabidra, the first dragon. Valinio confirmed the name, and Ulrich explained that looking at it, Ruabidra walked almost the exact same path as Hestio. He was offered to leave with the gods but stayed behind on Earth to save his kin. Ulrich noted that such a story would turn the Holy Church upside down if they heard it, as the scriptures explicitly stated Hestio was the only one, but he insisted this was the truth. However, despite trying to walk the same path, dragons and humans met different ends. When the Duke asked why that was, Ulrich explained that unlike humans, dragons do not usually group up. Their pride was so strong that they refused to form flocks and did not easily submit, not even to their own progenitor. Ruabidra must have tried until the very end, but in the end, their arrogance brought about the decline of their race. Ulrich told the Duke, whom he addressed as Balin, that he would probably understand it more clearly once he met Narvakeani, but warned that the dragon would not be able to fill his emptiness. As he spoke, a series of heavy, thundering booms shook the tower. Roberta asked in a panic what that sound was as a massive shadow loomed over the ruins. Ulrich looked into the darkness and identified the threat as a giant. The gargantuan, one-eyed creature roared, swinging a massive tree trunk like a club. Ulrich commanded them to dodge as a spear whistled through the air, grabbing Roberta and pulling her to safety as the stone walls shattered. Valineo rushed over, frantically asking if they were all right, and Roberta confirmed that everyone on their side was safe. Ulrich stood his ground and told Roberta to stand back. She watched him with wide eyes, calling out to her liege in concern, but he told her not to worry. He explained that giants generally had poor wits but still belonged to the category of intelligent beings who did not blindly eat humans like monsters did. As a massive, red, vine-like limb swept through the ruins, Ulrich noted that, of course, there were ignorant ones like this. He moved with blinding speed, his own mana vines lashing out and striking the giant with a powerful impact that shook the earth. The giant collapsed with a heavy thud, and Ulrich walked toward the fallen beast, asking if it remembered him. The giant groaned in pain, recognizing him as the human king and admitting it was hit. It pleaded for him to go and tell Uar that it was waiting there. Later, as the sun began to set over the frozen horizon, Roberta drifted off to sleep against a stone pillar. Ulrich reached out and gently tapped her shoulder, calling her name. He told her that if she wanted to rest, she should lie down comfortably. Roberta startled awake with a sharp breath, her eyes darting around as she argued that they did not know when another giant might come and attack. Ulrich looked at her calmly and explained that they were nearing the destination of their journey, and to endure until the end, she needed to save her strength. As they sat by the fire, a series of heavy thumps began to echo through the valley. Roberta looked on in fear as the thuds grew louder, but Ulrich assured her that those approaching would guide them the rest of the way. A massive green-skinned giant with long white hair emerged from the trees and immediately scooped Ulrich up in a crushing embrace. The giant roared with laughter, shouting Ulrich's name and asking if it had been 10 years since they last met. Ulrich corrected him, noting it had been a little over 12 years. The giant's voice boomed like thunder, remarking that it must have felt like a moment for the Lord. Roberta watched in awe, realizing this giant was completely different from the aggressive ones they had encountered. The giant noted that he had heard a lot had happened in that time, praising Ulrich for having sharp ears for someone living out there. Ulrich replied that he had his own ways of hearing things. The giant then turned his gaze to Roberta, asking if Ulrich had gotten himself a new woman in the meantime. Roberta was indignant, asking to be excused, but Ulrich clarified that she was his priestess and that Alonso had raised her. The giant was surprised, calling Alonso a sneaky bastard for raising a child, and noted that since he passed on his legacy, human time was indeed short. Roberta wondered why he called her mentor sneaky. The giant then got to the point, asking if they were looking for Narvakeani. Ulrich confirmed they were. Valineo stepped forward, and the giant asked what he planned to do once they found him, expressing he did not want a repeat of what happened last time. Ulrich introduced the Duke as Balin, explaining that the child was a descendant of Narvakeani who wished to meet his father. The giant's massive hand gripped Valineo's face as he marveled at the rarity of a dragon-human hybrid, noting it was the first he had seen since Ruabidra died. Ulrich corrected him, stating there had been a few more in between. He then presented a heavy sack, stating he would pay the price with goods received from the forest elves. The giant accepted the payment and asked if Ulrich wanted a guide to the entrance. Ulrich agreed, and the giant signaled his companions, promising to escort them with care. Roberta let out a small sound of surprise as she was lifted up by the giants. Suddenly, the scene shifted to a breathtaking meadow filled with vibrant blue flowers under a clear sky. A beautiful figure with long, flowing silver hair lay amongst the blossoms, their eyes fluttering open. Sensing a presence, the figure mused that somebody was coming this way. Sitting up with a graceful movement, the silver-haired being looked toward the horizon and decided they should prepare to welcome the guests.
Most people miss the real story. Subscribe if you want to see everything.